It's this weird situation. You know, let's welcome some relatively good news, but we just know it's going to get worse for Victoria.
Yeah, and it's masked. The unemployment rate is masked by JobKeeper, Tom. And, you know, you can't have JobKeeper for 5 years. You can have it until the next election, which could be late next year. And I think that's part of the government's thinking. Don't worry about that. Scott Morrison got offended when I asked him about that, but I think that's very much the way of thinking, because it's better to have 7.5% unemployment as you go to an election, or perhaps 8%, than it is to have 13%. Having said that, Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg very open when they talk about what they call the effective unemployment rate. They talk about sort of 13%. So we know about these stood-down workers in airlines and other places, and now in Victoria, who aren't going to work and are getting paid a government subsidy. That is what is affecting this figure. But as you say, the lockdowns hadn't been factored in now. We would expect a higher figure next month. But you wonder if we will get to 10, particularly with the extension of JobKeeper 2.0, the announcement last week, which effectively only had to qualify in terms of a loss of turnover of 30% over 1 quarter instead of 2 quarters, which they had decided was the way to go just 2 weeks earlier. So that will help significantly. But Victoria, in for some real problems in terms of the unemployment rate, Victoria, next month. Because some of those jobs with such a hard lockdown will slip through the JobKeeper net.
Well, Victoria, so for the month of July, Victoria's unemployment rate's actually gone from 7.5 down to 6.8.
Incredible,
so that's
isn't it?
That's an indication of what's coming.
Incredible.
They're in a harder lockdown now in Melbourne than they've ever been. So you can imagine what that could bounce back to.
So this is for the first half of last month, isn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, first 2 weeks. This is a survey on the first 2 weeks of July.
And didn't the shutdown occur slightly after that or around then? The lockdown of the postcodes began around July 4, I think. And then the following week was the Melbourne-wide shutdown, the stage 3. So you'd think I guess people hadn't lost their jobs by then. The following month's when it hits, and the month after that in terms of the stage 4 lockdown, I guess.
Yeah, so down 0.7 in that time. Essentially all of the hardened lockdown, the hardest one we've had in the whole country, right through Melbourne, huge part of the economy, has all happened since this survey, Andrew.
And that, you may ask, why is the unemployment rate dropping in Melbourne at that time? Well, that was the lifting of restrictions. Daniel Andrews had the hardest restrictions. He had taken them off. Obviously, a lot of jobs had come back. But, yeah, I think the federal government would be pretty happy with that news. It could be worse. They were expecting 7.8. That's what I heard last night in terms of the unemployment rate. So, but, you know, they also know what the real situation is. And once all those government supports come out, where they're going to be. I mean, those supports include insolvencies, kind of a freeze on insolvencies, and ability to trade while insolvent, for example.
Well, exactly. That's another mask figure. Look, the hardest thing about this is it's such a lag figure. We say, well, it's good that things were a little bit better than we thought back then. I want to probe this as well. I thought this was quite interesting today. A comment from Simon Birmingham, the Tourism Minister, that states, this was a warning. I didn't see anything direct around what the implications are on this, but states, if you keep up your borders when you shouldn't, so let's give an example of WA and the hard border. They don't care what's happening in NT and South Australia and ACT and Tassie. You still can't go there, essentially. If those tourism businesses are hemorrhaging as a result, well, then you might have to fork out your own money. But how do you do that, Andrew? How do you decide, is it all of tourism suddenly is, left high and dry? How would state voters feel about the federal government there? I get the federal government's point entirely, but it's a question of how you actually go about making that change, or is it just a bit of a threat hoping that there's a rethink on the borders? Yeah,
Tom, I heard you monster Pat Gorman before about why isn't South Australia open to WA. Fair point. I think this is an empty threat from Simon Birmingham and the federal government. I mean, they make these threats, don't they? Too hard to do? Well, they say this, we're not going to extend JobKeeper. OK, you have to open your borders. There'll be no more support. The states have to put in. We're going to change the rules around JobKeeper. Then comes the back down. So there's nothing at the moment to say that the government can say these words. They can use this rhetoric to try and put the heat on the states. But if the states don't respond, they don't look like they're going to carry out the threats because their own electoral fortunes hinge on it. I mean, Gorman himself has this polling we ran yesterday, which showed the Liberal primary vote after their stance on opening the hard borders had declined by 10% in his seat, 11%. And WA's hard border position is very popular there. Queensland's hard border position is very popular there. Scott Morrison was elected because of wins in those states. 23 of 30 seats in Queensland are Scott Morrison's and his government. So, he's never going to really push the button on forcing people to open borders. And there's certainly a view in the National Cabinet, as I understand it, that JobKeeper allows borders to be shut longer. That's the kind of perverse effect of it, Tom. As long as you've got the state government does not feel the pressure of unemployment.
Not the same pressure anyway, is it, that they can sort of stay on life support, courtesy of dollars from the federal government. So it's being put to me that the situation is more about additional support in those states that keep the borders up, for example. If there's no reason you won't get additional support, I guess the question remains... How
much support do they need? They've got JobKeeper.
Well, they've got JobKeeper. And I completely understand the point of the federal government on this when you're talking about, let's say, WA to NT, why on earth you need the border up there. But again, if you're going to hand out additional support to, say, New South Wales and not give it to WA, it doesn't matter if it's a good reason or not. It's going to hurt you, isn't it, to some degree? How parochial they're getting over there in the West, for example.
Well, let's see them muscle up and do it instead of just talking about it, because they've spent months talking about it. We're going to do this, we're going to do that to you. Nothing happens. The JobKeeper gets retained across the nation, not just for Victoria, where I argue there should be greater emphasis. Now, they will say, more people will get JobKeeper in Victoria because it's locked down, but that's fair enough. But there's no doubt there's electoral considerations at play here. So Simon Birmingham, he's saying that. Let's see you do something about it, Minister.
The big test case is going to be the Northern Territory election. Maybe I'm not cynical enough. I'm surprised the extent to which Michael Gunner's running on this. He even seems to be sort of echoing the COVID campaign, to use his own. We'll keep you safe. If this works well, Queensland will roll it out.
Yeah.
You can bet on that. Maybe the question is, though, is there a point at which voters say, OK, we get it, the borders are up, we haven't had any cases for 4 months, now we need to let the people in from the safe states because we are starting to hurt. That point would come at some time, wouldn't it?
Has it now and won't in the period the next 3 elections are due. Northern Territory in a week and a half, Queensland in October, WA early next year. So I don't think it'll become an issue till then. Having said that, when Michael Gunner said we're going to be shut for 18 months, there was a bit of pushback against that. People want to know, as you say, that the borders are shut for the time being, particularly with the situation in Victoria. They don't want to know a reality where they'll be shut for 18 months. People come from other states, particularly in the Northern Territory. They have family in other states. They have business they want to do with other states. All this plays in. And also with Queensland, you'd have a different view in North Queensland, where they're really hurting in Cairns and Townsville from a tourism point of view on this, compared to South East Queensland. South East Queensland would be a lot more bolshy on the border than up north. And there's some marginal seats for Anastasia Palaszczuk up north. That's going to be interesting to look at that divide come election time. But certainly the Victorian situation has justified her position. Without that, you could see Deb Frecklington making a bit of ground on it.